Well, the Washington Post is out with a new report on how the Republican Party's schism or split with the Chamber of Commerce and with corporate America in general is creating a vacuum that the Biden White House is seeking to exploit by being in really intense conversations and staying close with leaders in the business community when it comes to their plan for taxes, their plan for business policy in general, and all of that good stuff, which is now happening in the absence of the Republican Party's close or traditionally tight-knit relationship with the Chamber of Commerce. That split is really falling along cultural lines. The Biden White House is eagerly stepping into the gap, as the Washington Post reports, having conversations with CEOs at Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, keeping them in the loop on all of this and working with them to really think about what kind of policies they'd get behind and that the Biden White House can get behind, and having that push and pull. Maybe that would happen whether or not Republicans actually did break with the Chamber of Commerce, as we've seen in recent days and recent weeks. But nevertheless, it does make it a lot more appealing for the business community to find allies in the Biden White House. I think it also speaks to the emerging coalitions that the Democratic Party is responsive to. We see in J.D. Vance's recent conversation with Tucker Carlson a very good example of why that split is happening. Let's play the clip.
But wait a second, JD. Google is a private company, and we have no interest in attempting to constrain or control its behavior.
I know people say that. Yeah.
What do you say when they do?
Well, my reaction to that is first of all, if I'm being honest, I just don't care.
Good. Good for you.
I don't care if Google's a private company because it has too much power. And if you want to have a country where people can live their lives freely, you have to be concerned about power, whether it's concentrated in the government or concentrated in big corporations. So my first response is I don't care.
That is exactly what Democrats are seeking to exploit. That it is hard to overstate how profoundly a dissent from Republican dogma that comment from J.D. Vance is. He does not care about regulating Google because they have too much power. He does not care that Google is a private company because they simply have too much power at this point. That is not your dad's Republican Party. That is a very new Republican Party. Whether it actually translates into substantive policy making and legislation and goes beyond sort of talking points, we'll have to see. But that is where you're seeing the business community make these inroads in the Biden White House, and seeing the Biden White House happily share these conversations with them and share the policymaking process with them. My question for you, Crystal, is how do you think this is going to influence the results, right? Is the push and pull that's now happening between the Biden White House and an overeager Chamber of Commerce sort of sect of the business community, will that yield results for progressives? Will that bring the business community sort of closer to the left than it was before on economic issues? Or is this just actually going to do the opposite and allow the sort of centrism to have more of an ear in the policymaking process?
Yeah, I mean, look, Biden's meeting with the Chamber of Commerce, the National Restaurant Association, and these other people who I consider to be villains, and aggressively reaching out to corporate America to make sure they're okay with what he's doing, then that is going to hamper and decrease the impact of what he ultimately does. He's making sure he keeps his promise that nothing is going to fundamentally change. So corporations have not kicked up as much of a fuss as you might expect over him hiking the corporate tax rate, which now, look, he originally said 28%, which is already less than the 35% that it used to be before the Republicans cut their taxes down to 21. Now, so he already was taking I'll sort of go a little bit of the way there, but not all the way there at 28%. Immediately, Joe Manchin comes in, National Restaurants, all these people, we can't have even that, so it's 25%. The big corporations don't even pay these taxes at all, so I think they also find it somewhat irrelevant. So that's on the one side, and I'll just say, for all the people who are like, Biden is like FDR and he hangs the portrait in office and whatever. Remember, Biden is welcoming these people in to get their advice on what he should do, whereas FDR welcomed their hatred. So it's a very different posture towards the business community, and one that I find very troubling. On the other hand, I think you give the right way too much credit here, because J.D. Vance is in a primary for the Ohio State. He's probably not going to win. I mean, he comments like that might be in line with how Trump ran in 2016, but it's not the way Trump governed. He governed. I mean, he just on Hannity the other night in his big interview. He said his biggest accomplishment in office was cutting corporate taxes. That's your populist Republican president. You know, so I just don't see that there's been any real change in terms of how Republicans are actually governing, even as they're happy to say the words working class now and hate on Google because of JD is different because, and again, he's not an elected politician in the Republican Party, which I think is telling. If he wins the primary, that'll be a different story. But, you know, most of the objections that Republicans raise about big tech, with a few narrow exceptions, are just about like, we don't like that you're censoring these accounts, but then they don't really care when the left is censored. So it's just precisely about like, you need to do the things that we want you to do, not that we actually want to check your power. And the way you know that is Mitch McConnell came out and made these comments after Georgia that were like, you know, CEOs, corporate CEOs need to stay out of politics. You go and look at his campaign finance disclosure. He took in more money from CEOs than anyone else in the country. The number 2 person on that list is David Perdue of Georgia. Georgia being the state that, of course, sparked this whole conversation over voting rights. So I would say both parties are way too close to corporate America, and unfortunately I don't see that changing anytime soon.
I saw a really interesting statistic last week. I think it was from last quarter of Kevin McCarthy, who's absolutely a Republican establishment figure. I think it was around 2% of the money he raised in the last quarter came from corporate PACs, which is, for Republicans, that's a small number. And I would say also, I do agree that the Republican Party's complaints against big tech are largely cultural. I think that's the priority, is a cultural one. But at the same time, I think what Josh Hawley is doing, and he seems to have the support of a lot of people, again, mainstream conservatives. Mitch McConnell is out of step with the Republican Party, wildly out of step, I would say, with the Republican Party. It's not that he isn't reading the tea leaves to some extent, because I think he probably is, but he is out of step with where the party is. I think that antitrust moves that Republicans have made, whether it's with tech, whether it's in any other sector, they've been pretty robust. I mean, Josh Hawley actually wants to break up these companies in the same way, and I think for some of the exact same reasons that Elizabeth Warren does and that Bernie Sanders do. I think their primary concerns here are actually, and I have this conversation with people on the right a lot, that a lot of the cultural complaints are downstream of the antitrust issues. So they get away with these things, the censorship, because they are monopolies.
Yes. Hawley is good on big tech. There are a couple others, but we also have to ask ourselves, what has made him a darling of the base? Going along with Stop This Deal. It has nothing to do with any of his economic policy. I mean, that is the path to being a star in the Republican Party. It has nothing to do with policy. I mean, the biggest Trump stars are like, you know, total like libertarian, like total old school Reaganite thinking on economics. So what's driving support within the Republican Party has nothing to do with any of these actual anti-corporate stances. And again, I just look at the record of how they voted since Biden has taken over. You know, immediately they rule out any tax hike on corporations. They're not going to go along with any of that. They didn't even come to the table on the relief bill, even though the provisions were wildly popular and they'd supported similar things under the Trump administration. So I just don't see any actual substance to some of the rhetorical shifts yet, but listen, I'm cheering for him. I'd love for you to be right.
They need to do a much better job of actually explaining how their policies do benefit the working class, and they're just not in that rhythm or that habit yet either, because it's so sort of like, it's a very ill-fitting conversation for Republicans to have. So they're not used to explaining things in those terms. So we'll see where they go going forward.
Next on Rising, Maximilian Alvarez and Marshall Kosloff are here for Team Rising. That is after this.